We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Hey, hello everybody. Welcome to the School of Public Policy's discussion on coal mining development in the Rockies. I'm Blake Schaefer. No, my name is not TBC. I'm a professor at the School of Public Policy, and I'll be your moderator for today. So clearly this is a topic of intense interest to Albertans. We see that in the sheer number of you that have registered for today's event, so thank you for joining us. And we saw that in the public outcry that occurred with changes to Alberta's long-standing policy of restricting coal mining activity in much of the Eastern Foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And now, if you've been following closely, you'll know the government recently backtracked to some degree, and Nigel Banks will help us get into that a little bit more later today, on the controversial rescindment of the 1976 policy surrounding coal mining in the Rockies, with the promise to, this time around, hold meaningful consultation on any new policy. So with that in mind, we think it's as topical as ever to have this discussion about what meaningful consultation should entail, about what policy gaps are created by the rescindment of the blanket policy, and how to think about the trade-offs from coal mining activity, or really any activity that pits economic development versus environmental stewardship. And importantly, how to value things clearly many Albertans cherish, but don't have a price tag. So before we begin, I want to make clear just what today's event is and isn't, because I think expectations can differ among many. So first off, it isn't a deep dive on the impacts of coal mining, nor the economic impacts of their development. Those who came here today to hear the latest and greatest, pardon me, on selenium mitigation technology, or how coal mining affects Indigenous treaty rights, will be sorely disappointed. These are critically important issues to discuss, and there are many forums where they're being discussed today. I encourage you to learn more on that front. But today's event is a higher level discussion. It's about how to incorporate all of these impacts when thinking about economic trade-offs, when thinking about regulatory landscapes, and thinking about cogent policy development. So with that, let's get going and introduce our panelists. Let me start with Nigel Banks. So Nigel is a professor of law here at the University of Calgary. He specializes in resource law and land use policy. He's also written a lot recently on Alberta's coal mining developments, and I encourage you to check out his detailed writing on the topic at ablawg.ca. That's ablawg.ca. So Nigel, thank you very much for joining us today. Marvin Schaefer. Marvin is a consulting economist and adjunct professor at the School of Public Policy at Simon Fraser University. Marvin's an expert on benefit cost analysis. He's actually written the textbook on it. He also wrote the guidelines on multiple account benefit cost analysis while working in the government of British Columbia. Marvin's going to help us in how to think about these trade-offs and how to incorporate diverse stakeholder views. Also, full disclosure, we are not brothers. Marvin is my dad, but I will do my best to refer to him throughout as Marvin today. And last but not least, Diane Dupont. Diane is a professor of economics at Brock University. Now, economists sometimes get a bad rap from folks who think we only place a value on items with a price tag. This really couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, there's a whole branch of economics that tries to do just the opposite, which is place a value on things without a market. Diane is a recognized expert in this area of non-market valuation, and a lot of her work these days focuses on water issues. Diane's here to walk us through some of the approaches economists use to quantify the value on things without a price. Okay, so let's get going. I've talked enough. Today's session is intended to be interactive, so we want to hear from you. I've got some starter questions to get the ball rolling, but the bulk of today will be putting your questions to the panelists. So you should see a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I want you to go ahead, write your questions in there, and also read other questions and click like on the ones that you most want to hear answered. The top voted questions will trickle up my screen, and I will do my best to get to them. A note on this, please keep your questions sharp. It's just me reading them. It will be a challenge for me to read all the questions, for there's nearly 200 of you on here. Also, we have a saying in academia, my question is more of a comment than a question. Please try your best not to be that academic today. We're looking for real questions to the panelists, okay? Okay, so let's start off with some background. Not everyone comes to this with the same level of knowledge on the topic. So Ashley, if you could share the map I shared with you earlier. There we go. So this map of Southwest Alberta, it shows the categories created by the 1976 Lougheed coal policy. So what you see here is 4 categories. The large one in green, category 1, this is the area completely off limits to coal mining development. In large part, this overlaps with many of our national parks. Category 2 is the area most affected by the rescindment of the policy. These are areas where open pit mining was previously restricted under most circumstances. So there were exceptions possible, but for all intents and purposes, activity in these areas was largely restricted and lease applications were not accepted, or leases were not granted, pardon me, in category 2. Applications laid dormant. You can see the area of leasing activity in gray within these areas. So you can see how important these orange category 2 areas were for potential development. This is the one where it has most shifted by the rescindment of the 1976 policy, opening these up to potential development. There's another category, category 4 in white. These were mostly previously disturbed areas. So areas that had previous mining activity. They were by and large open to new mining activity, subject to normal regulatory processes. So I want to turn it over to Nigel. We'll leave the map up for Nigel. Nigel, can you walk us through what's happened here in Alberta since May on this topic?
Sure, and thanks for the opportunity to join this conversation, Blake. So, as we know, in May, the Minister announced the revocation of the policy, and at the same time, the department issued an information letter on what was going to happen. And over the following 3 months, leases were granted in Category 2 lands for a further 186,000 hectares of land. So this was in addition to leases which were outstanding of being granted before the policy of 46,000 hectares. So this was a quadrupling of leased land within the Category 2 areas. And then further in December, the Crown held an additional leasing sale, resulting in the issuance of 11 new leases. And during this time, of course, opposition was growing. I think anyone living in southern Alberta is well aware of that growing opposition from non-governmental organizations, but also increasingly municipalities, First Nations, regional governments. And no doubt as a result of that chorus of opposition, the minister in January actually cancelled the leases that had been issued in the December Crown sale. But those leases represented only 1% or less than 1% of the leased area in Category 2. And then in February, the minister further announced, Minister Savage further announced the revocation of the reinstatement of the 76 coal policy, but only as it applied to Category 2 land. So there are a number of implications here. The first implication is that reinstatement had no effect on mining applications and operations in Category 4 lands that Blake has referred to. And this includes mining, which during the fall was subject to a joint federal provincial environmental assessment. The other thing to note is that as a result of the revocation of the policy, coal exploration activities ramped up, approved by the AER, And again, important to note that Minister Savage's reinstatement of the policy has no effect on those approved exploration activities. And finally, I think the point to make is that none of the leases, other than the leases granted in the Crown sale in December, have been cancelled. So all of those leases, which were issued to people who'd made applications before May, have been cancelled. They are in full force and effect. So that's where we are.
Okay. Thank you for that. I hope that gives those of you, especially those who aren't following this developments as closely, some background. So basically, door was opened in May. Some entered. Door has been shut for the time being, but those that entered largely stay put. And we have this parallel process of Category 4 mines that really was unaffected that continues today. So Marvin, I want to go to you and I want to talk a little bit about, well, basically the opportunity, as I said, you wrote the textbook on this, how to think about trade-offs. Can you speak to the methodology you've developed to weigh the benefits of costs of these trade-offs and importantly, incorporate these diverse stakeholder perspectives, because of course, not all of us are going to weigh costs and benefits the same way.
Sure, thanks, Blake. And you can refer to me however you want, but you'll always be my older brother as far as I'm concerned. So let me just step back and think about what we're trying to do here. We're trying to provide some analysis that'll inform the debate about the public interest in alternative policies. As we all know, public interest to many people is what's most important to them. But in fact, and Jen Winters from your policy school and her colleagues wrote a good paper on public interest that's not terribly well defined or defined at all in most legislation, but clearly it requires a consideration of the full range of consequences to different people and interests and some weighing of those consequences. So the traditional economist approach, as they're trying to advise, whether it's regulatory bodies or just more generally public policy debate, would be a form of benefit cost analysis, where we look at all of the positive and negative consequences of a policy alternative, and we try to estimate the value that people place on that by the amount they'd be willing to give up or willing to pay for the positive, and the amount they'd have to be compensated for the negative. And ultimately, we'd be looking at some bottom line. Is the value of the benefits, do they exceed the costs? Is what people are willing to pay for the positive greater than what they'd have to be compensated? And this is over all people who are affected by this, or at least within the jurisdiction. The problem with that, though, and it's very well formulated and methodology, but the problem that we have and we've seen is that not all of these consequences, and particularly some of the environmental and social consequences, can meaningfully and reliably be monetized and aggregated into a bottom line. And we'll hear there's different techniques. Diane will tell us, I'm sure, in terms of trying to bring perspective to these, but it's very difficult to add up the value of a job with the value of a unique environmental attribute. And it wouldn't be considered meaningful. And there's lots of philosophical problems as well as empirical problems with that. And there's also a problem of just trying to look at a bottom line to inform a public debate, because it doesn't tell us anything about the distributional consequences, the nature of the benefits, the nature of the costs, who wins, who loses. So the approach that I've used and I recommend and I've written about is a multiple account approach to benefit cost analysis. It isn't an abandonment of the principles of benefit cost analysis, as many have done with single criteria and multi-criteria and other approaches, but rather it's an attempt to look at the consequences of alternative policies in a very structured and principled and objective way. and that would include, of course, if we think of coal policy or if we think of any project or policy, what are we talking about? Well, we're obviously talking about, because it's of great interest to people and communities, the impacts on economic activity, on employment opportunities, business opportunities. We'd be looking at the consequences for government in some kind of taxpayer account. What does it mean for government revenues, for government expenditures, and as you'll be talking about later, I believe, in terms of liabilities that the governments and therefore taxpayers assume. And then what does it mean for the environment, for natural resources, water, recreational, other, for environmental attributes, for GHGs, and of course, in some policies and considerations, criteria air contaminant, pollutant emissions. And what does it mean for, in the social sphere, for communities, for First Nations, in terms of their traditional resources and activities and interests, local communities, and broader social concerns. And the analysis that we'd want to do in all of those areas and keep them disaggregated is to look at the incremental effects. How will the world be different? And here's something I want to emphasize, and I think it'll be really important in the debate over the coal policy. There's a tendency both by proponents and opponents, advocates on all sides, just to look at gross impacts. So how many jobs might be associated with this? How many GHGs might be embedded in the coal? But the question is, what will be the difference in the employment opportunities and earnings? What will be the incremental effects that we want to evaluate in that economic activity account? Similarly with taxes, we see too many impact analyses that aggregate up all the possible taxes that are associated with the business activity associated with a policy or a project. And what we really want to know is, well, what is the incremental taxes? How will they be larger, or to what extent and under what circumstances? And we'll want to know, and what are the net effects, net of the government expenditures that go with that and the liabilities it incurs. And similarly for the environment, we'll want to know the net effects, both with respect to GHGs and other things. And at the end of that analysis, where we're following pretty much a benefit cost approach, but we're keeping it disaggregated. We're not trying to monetize and come to a bottom line. What we're hoping to do to inform the debate is to crystallize the trade-off. And if the trade-off here is between some incremental economic activity and government revenues versus the loss of resources or environmental attributes, not all of which we can necessarily monetize in a reliable and meaningful way, we'll want to crystallize that debate. So we'll challenge the advocates on one side or the other to say why the value of that non-monetized effect is worth it or not.
So we'll
and so it's to get to that valuation as opposed to trying to just answer the questions to inform and focus that debate.
So we'll get to that valuation of the, like you say, the environmental attributes. Pardon me. But I want to go to one question from the audience here that makes this a bit more concrete. They ask, how do you best balance local interests and those of stakeholders less directly affected in cost-benefit analysis to inform decisions? I think part of the framing here, there's clearly local and economic benefits, especially in the Crow's Nest Pass. And even the Premier, sort of in part of responding to some of the opposition, accused some of the Albertan opponents to the policy changes as city dwellers who might like to go to the parks occasionally, but they're neglecting the fact this has big economic benefits to local folks. It was clearly, the accusation was probably misplaced, because these were people in the foothills who are equally as upset. But how do you weigh that, those who are really directly affected locally versus a broader Albertan perspective?
So one of the reasons you use a multiple account approach is that very concern that you really have to identify, well, what does this mean for the local interests as a separate evaluation account? And then we have to ask the question, one of the first formulations of this approach said, we're going to look at the overall net benefits of an undertaking. In other words, let's say broad Albertan approach. And we'll go with that unless there are social concerns that overweigh that. And so that's the trade-off. So you'd have to say, is the local concern, if it's different from, pointing in a different direction than the broader interest, of such a magnitude that it should dominate the decision? And that's a debate you would have to have. The other thing, of course, is one of the reasons you do this is to see the extent to which you can align the local and the broader interests. In other words, to restructure the policy to accommodate these distributional concerns.
Okay. Yeah, I guess as by disaggregating it, we really get better transparency on the distributional
and the
impacts.
reasons why you are or are not making it. It's
Right.
challenging people to be very clear on the evaluation of the different types and locations, if you like, of consequences.
Okay. Diane, I want to bring you in here. So, big part of the trade-off we're talking about, especially in this instance, is a change in otherwise pristine wilderness. Something Albertans clearly value, but there isn't a price tag on it. So can you walk us through some of the approaches economists use to put a value on non-market goods like clean water, pristine forests, unfettered wildlife, and the like?
Yes, thanks very much. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. This is a really important issue, of course. I want to back up for just a second and put a little bit of context here, which I think hasn't been addressed yet, which is when we think about market prices, they reveal the value or benefit that someone's willing to give up in order to acquire a good or service that they can use directly. So coal, timber, et cetera. The challenge with this type of situation, and anytime we involve the environment, is that many of the goods and services that provide benefit from the natural environment come in the form of what we call indirect use or passive use values. Now, indirect use benefits are things like services, recreational experiences, health benefits, aesthetic, and then just things that are a little less tangible, but equally important, which are what we call ecosystem services. So things like flood control, water purification, wildlife habitat. So those are indirect use benefits. We also have passive use benefits. And these take the form of essentially a desire to preserve the natural environment in its current state. In other words, not see a degradation to it. Even though someone might not want to directly use the environment, they want it to be preserved. And so the challenge, of course, is that these indirect use and passive use services are not bought and sold in a market, generally speaking. So we have an imbalance in the information that we've got when we do any decision making. We've got a lot of good information on market values. Effectively, we've got zero values associated with these other things in a dollar kind of term. So economists have developed a number of what are called non-market valuation techniques, essentially to estimate the values, the benefits associated with these indirect and passive use goods and services. And roughly speaking, these non-market valuation techniques fall into two kind of broad categories. The first one is called revealed preference. And in all of this, we're really trying to figure out, what do people want? What do they prefer? And so with revealed preference, economists use actual behavior in actual markets to essentially identify the value of ecosystem goods and services. So let me give you an example. I'm sure most people in the audience have done some water-based recreation. Now, typically, that may or may not involve the payment of a nominal fee to enter a park. And if it's not a park, there's not a fee associated with it. However, there are decisions that people need to make in advance in order for them to be able to experience this water-based activity. They need to possibly buy a canoe, buy fishing equipment, get themselves to the location. All of those are market activities. And what we do is we measure the extent to which someone is willing to pay for example, better water quality through the, and Marv talked about incremental, through the incremental amount of money they would be willing to pay on those expenditures in the market to get themselves to a location that has better water quality. So that's one way in which we kind of measure benefits. There are other ways that are similar to this. So I'm sure everyone's very aware of property pricing, housing pricing, and we can, you can kind of think, well, an extra bedroom is going to give me this much extra money on my house price and things like that. In addition to that, houses are fixed in location, They may have amenity values, views of green space, views of mountains attached with them. We can, again, essentially compare two houses that have otherwise identical characteristics. One has the mountain view, one doesn't. We can take a look at what the difference in the house price might be. That gives us a sense to which someone has been willing to pay in order to experience that. So that's the one type, the kind of revealed preference. But the problem is we have a lot of values that, for example, the passive values, there is no related market. So we need to do what's called stated preference. And stated preference involves developing questionnaires that essentially put the person into a situation of looking at a baseline situation, describing what things look like, and an alternative situation describing how things might be different, and then ask the person, do you prefer A, do you prefer B? And typically attached to A and B is some form of additional expenditure that must be incurred to get those benefits. And it's through that that we can figure out how much people value things. And these types of surveys have been used in real world situations. So for example, in 1989, there was an oil spill in the Strait of Alaska. As subsequently, this methodology, contingent valuation, was used to put a value on the damages. And this ultimately was used in settling an out of court situation between the government of Alaska and the oil company. So these are values that are definitely used. Contingent valuation is one. More recently, people are using what are called choice tasks, where we're literally identifying components of a situation. So Marvin talked about incremental. So for example, a particular policy might impact water quality or different types of habitats in different measures. We could look at how our marginal or incremental values might change as a result of that. So these all give, to some extent, dollar terms, but they can also give trade-offs in terms of the attributes themselves. So Marvin was talking about multi-use accounts. This can again be used in that way.
That's wonderful. And like I said, this is a whole field of economics. There's full courses on non-market valuation, and Diane just gave us an excellent overview in 5 minutes. So thank you very much for that. Nigel, I want to go to you. There's a couple of questions coming in here. I wanted to talk about policy gaps that were left exposed by the rescindment of the 1976 policy. So as we go to consultations to perhaps have a new policy, one person asks, are there components of the 1976 policy besides the land use categories that have not been replaced by modern legislation? Example, Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act. Even more broadly, how does this, was the 1976 policy a de facto land use policy, and do we have a replacement in all regions? So can you speak to policy gaps that need to be addressed?
Oh, sure, and thanks for the question. And I guess to understand the question and to properly answer it, we do have to understand what the 76 policy was all about. And it makes for an interesting read in 2021. It was partly an industrial policy. It had a royalty policy section, and in part it was an energy security policy, insofar as most of our generation at the time was coal-based, so we needed to know that we had access to thermal coal for those power plants. And then, of course, it had this categorization of lands, and I think one can and should think about that categorization as a sector-specific land use policy. So what's happened since then? Well, we've certainly got lots of new legislation, new policy, and clearly much of that 1976 policy has been superseded by events. I mean, we know that we're moving out of thermal coal. Alberta will be off coal target 2030, but we'll actually achieve it before 2030. But the one, I think it's really true to say that the one enduring feature of the 76 policy was this land use categorization. So to focus on that, then, we need to ask the question, well, what's Alberta done in the area of land use planning since '76. And it has taken one incredibly important step in sort of 2008, 2009 under the then Stelmach government. And that was to say, well, we recognize project-based assessments are not adequate. We need to be concerned about cumulative effects. We need to be concerned about landscape level planning. And to respond to that, we adopted a land use planning framework, which is essentially a policy document, which was then implemented statutorily by ALSA, the Alberta Land Stewardship Act. And what ALSA contemplated was regional level land use planning, addressing cumulative effects and offering guidance as to future developments which might be considered, those which might not, areas of additional protected area status. And so one could say then, ALSA and the land use planning framework clearly had the potential to supersede the '76 coal policy. But to move beyond potential to actual supersession, one has to have land use plans for each of the regions affected by the coal policy. And one has to dig into the detail and ask, well, did they actually supersede the policy? And I think the answer is clearly no. And no for a couple of reasons. First of all, we've only got one completed plan affecting the coal policy areas, and that's the South Saskatchewan plan. Many other plans have not even been initiated, and the North Saskatchewan plan seems to be on hold. But then if we focus on the South Saskatchewan plan and we ask, well, did it make decisions effectively superseding the policy? And the answer is, again, both in relation to that plan and to some sub-regional plans like the Livingstone area plan is, no, they didn't. Or they might have made some steps along the way, but they were largely premised on an understanding that the coal policy categories needed to be revisited, and they weren't in fact being revisited as part of these plans. So one might say that's, well, why did that happen? Isn't that a problem? And I think it is a problem with our regional planning process. And I think the problems are twofold. One, it's proceeded at an incredibly slow pace, and it hasn't dealt with these holistic issues. You've got sort of remnants of other plans like the coal policy that were hanging in there, and then were superseded, then were revoked without having addressed this gap. So my response to the question is, yes, there's still a fundamental gap into landscape level planning. And the implication of that then is that, you know, we created, almost describe it as a leasing free for all. We granted all of these leases, and that pushes us into project-based assessments rather than broad landscape level planning.
Right. So in many ways, you know, rescinding the '76 policy has really shown a spotlight on this deficiencies in, like you say, system-wide or landscape-wide land use planning. This is a good segue into a question from Jackie, which is, you know, how are you touched on this, but how are cumulative effects from several mines accounting for in the methodology, especially in big river basins going to downstream provinces? Maybe Marvin, I can come back to you. So, you know, whether it's in the multiple account benefit cost framework, how are we dealing with cumulative effects, or perhaps you can speak to environmental impact assessments that are done on a project basis. You know, how are cumulative effects dealt with in that regard?
On the project level, I'd say not well.
Yeah.
And I think that just furthers the point that Nigel was making, that you can do a proper analysis of incremental cumulative effects, but you have to be doing it of the landscape policy. In other words, you need that, you need the larger analysis done before you get to project by project studies, or people will be very dissatisfied that you'll be making a series of small decisions going forward all of which may have relatively minor effects, but cumulatively are very severe or significant. So the way I look at it is, yes, we need to look at cumulative effects when we're dealing with decisions that have cumulative consequences. And on the project by project, the only thing you could say is the way in which cumulative consequences come to play is as you move along, the same effect has greater significance because it's on top of, or it could have different significance because it's on top of what's already taken place.
Does that create a rush to get in first, to be the one that's in our project by project analysis?
It certainly could create a rush, and where you have to step back with the policy, and why you want a policy framework is so that you can answer the larger question of the development plan, and then let the projects go ahead on their particular incremental and unique effects.
Right. So it's sort of, I think that's one of the things we're developing here. It's, what Nigel's pointing out is especially in the absence of the blanket 1976 restriction policy, we're left without a broad land use plan, a development plan for the region. So it really places the imperative on getting that, is what it sounds like, to make sure we're not just looking in isolation at projects.
Right. Ideally, project analysis is done within the context of that landscape plan.
Right. So, Diane, maybe this is something that you can opine on. Another question here on reclamation. I know it's not exactly your area, but talk about how is reclamation incorporated in the analysis. Reclamation in Category 2 lands will be very difficult, and the taxpayers are probably on the hook for many years after the mining companies leave. I had written some thoughts on this previously about, the part of the touting of this type of development is that it's metallurgical coal, not thermal coal. So we are quickly moving away from thermal coal, but this is steel making coal, and the government argued that it's going to be needed for the foreseeable future. We don't have great alternatives, but with the increasing focus on decarbonization and new forms of steel making using hydrogen and electricity over traditional blast furnaces and coking coal, it's an open question as to what the future demand looks like for metallurgical coal. So, how should the government consider those risks, these potential end-of-life reclamation liabilities in what could be a waning resource?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a really challenging thing. I think really what we need to think about is, as we're using environmental resources for some productive activity, we need to think about the life cycle of the mine. So in other words, as we start, we were talking earlier about projects, when we evaluate it, it's not simply we're going to be evaluating the kind of immediate benefits, if you will, of the mine, but we need to be thinking as we go through time, what will be the end state of the mine? And it's a good question. What do we want that space to look like after the mine is no longer serving a useful purpose? Do we want it to look like what it was before? That's probably not going to be a possible option. So then what form do we want that to look like? And that could certainly be a part of an analysis where, and in particular, an analysis of a project from beginning to end. What is the end state? And I mean, some people have talked about looking at these kinds of projects and then asking companies to post what's called a reclamation bond or a green bond. So in other words, they put up a sum of money that could fund the reclamation that would take place at whatever point in the future. From a valuation perspective, that becomes really tricky because we're trying to forecast a lot of different things, not the least of which is how are people's preferences going to be changing about what they want from a landscape, what they want from an ecosystem over time. And so it's not that it can't be done, but I think, to come back to both Nigel's and Marvin's points, all of this needs to be done within a bigger framework of what is it the government of Alberta wants for its citizens from the resources it has, from the myriad resources it has. And that involves a land use planning framework, but not just that. Other kinds of frameworks need to feed into that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to ask this one because it's getting the most votes by far on the Q&A. I don't know if we have the answers, so if you do, chime in. But how does Alberta's coal policies, so the 1976 policy and other documents, compare to other jurisdictions, perhaps specifically British Columbia? Because I guess a lot has been made that, you know, right on the other side of the border, especially in the Crow's Nest Pass, there are several metallurgical coal mines, near, you know, in around Sparwood and Elkford, north of around Fernie. Nigel or Marvin or Diane, do you have any knowledge on how we differ?
Nigel, I would turn to you, but one thing I would point out from the analysis, just in terms of benefits and costs, there is a big difference between the closure of mines, if you were to do that, and the opening up of mines. And the costs and consequences are quite different, even though it may look similar. That it's of much greater significance when you change and have to give up something than when you create something. But I couldn't speak to the differences in the policy. Maybe Nigel, you have that.
No, I'm going to beg off that one too, but perhaps one slightly different response, which is to say that in this competitive future for metallurgical coal and market access, and this does relate to, you know, the long-term liabilities, because one of the concerns will be if you develop a mine with the expectation that it's going to be able to access this market, will it be able to? As demand for metallurgical coal drops, which we assume it will for greenhouse gas reasons, we'll move to electric arc furnaces and hydrogen. Will Alberta metallurgical coal be competitive? And I put that as a question. It's certainly out there as a question in the context of the Grassy Mountain project, because there's some suggestion that Elk Valley coal is higher quality met coal than would come out of Grassy Mountain. So that suggests that, you know, we should be concerned about mines not living out their expected life, and therefore the question of has enough money been set aside to deal with reclamation and abandonment, or are we going to be in insolvency and restructuring? So it's a question about, you know, and I think it goes back to Marvin's earlier comments. People tend to overstate the benefits of their proposed projects, and the benefits of met coal projects depend very much on the quality of the met coal they offer by comparison with other projects.
Well, let's turn to a question that's talking about the potential overstatement of benefits and or costs. A question from Gavin here. The question of benefit cost analysis versus economic impact analysis. So one that economists hold near and dear, this type of thing. And gross impacts versus incremental impacts. This came up at the Grassy Mountain hearing. And Gavin says, as I understand it, the AER, which is our regulator here in Alberta, accepts economic impact analyses done by proponents, which assesses gross impacts in terms of taxes, employment, etc., not net impacts. Oh, it just moved on me. Is there some historical or conceptual reason why this is the case? I.e., why doesn't the AER insist on a proper benefit cost analysis? Marvin?
Because it's no different than virtually every other environmental and social impact assessment panel. Well, partly it's because of the difficulty with benefit cost analysis. Certainly the National Energy Board, some of you may remember way back when, used to require benefit cost analyses for gas export and other permits, and it abandoned that in part because of the difficulty and the array of assumptions that was needed to get to a bottom line. But one of the argument I'd make, if you back off the end goal of trying to get what are the overall net benefits, clearly it's a mistake for regulatory bodies to focus on economic impacts or economic impacts alone, because they don't tell you the extent to which workers are better off. I've worked on projects where the proponent touts the creation of jobs, like in ski areas, for example, and there's no workers. They have to bring the workers in. So sure, there's jobs and there is some local economic activity associated with that. But the jobs don't tell you the story. They don't tell you to what extent there are incremental earnings for Albertans in this case, or for Canadians, or in whatever jurisdiction you're looking at. I'd say the answer is it's done that way because it's easier and it suits the interests of the advocates. And I would say on both sides, because I think we see gross impacts on environmental concerns at times as well.
I think Andrew Leach had a great illustration of some of the absurdity of economic impact assessments sometimes when he talked about the spoon brigade. So rather than using, having pipelines, having an array of workers with spoons carrying resources and how many more jobs that would create. And so he sort of put the ad absurdum argument on it. But Nigel, this might be one for you. This is a question on category 2 versus category 4. And Diane, you could weigh in. I know this area isn't something of a close topic to you, but the category 4 being a previously disturbed area. So do you view a distinction between exploration and development on the previously restricted category 2 areas versus development of, for example, the Grassy Mountain project on a previously mined site in a category 4? And also a follow-up, has the government's handling of the coal policy rescindment and reinstatement changed perhaps the political prospects for Grassy Mountain, either from a regulatory perspective or public acceptability? They brought awareness to the issue of coal mining, whereas Grassy Mountain was probably flying under the radar, but for perhaps the 200 folks on our call today. But broadly speaking, I don't think most Albertans were aware of it. So any distinction for you on category 2 versus 4 developments?
So I can handle, I think, the second part of that question because, I come at this from a legal perspective. So the first part of the question, I'm not sure it's a legal question so much as a broader policy question. But on the second part, I think, if we ask where Grassy Mountain is at now, the panel hearings, and it was a joint review panel, concluded in the fall. We're expecting a panel report in June, unless it's pushed off. And on the federal side of that, the essential decision will be really a twofold decision. Will this project, as proposed, even with proposed mitigation measures, cause significant harm to the environment? And I think it'd be surprising if the conclusion were anything other than that. Clearly, there'll be big fisheries concerns, critical habitat of listed species of trout. So if we assume that, then the question is a political question for the Governor and Council. Can that be justified in the circumstances? And then I think you look at the outcry, that becomes a much tougher decision, even for a federal minister to make. The report will also feed into a provincial cabinet decision and an AER decision that will have to be made under the Coal Conservation Act, and that too will be a broad public interest determination. So I think, the politicization of the issue that we've seen will make it far from a slam dunk. Let's put it that way, that I don't think anyone should be assuming that Grassy is going to go ahead. And it does involve mountaintop mine removal. And although the minister is on record as saying, I don't support for any mountaintop removal in Alberta, if you look at the fine print, that comment was actually confined to category 2 mountaintop mine removal areas. But I think she's going to find it difficult to convince Albertans that that distinction is an appropriate distinction.
Right.
So I can weigh in on the first part of the question, if you like, in terms of essentially what we're talking about is, to the best that I understand it, Category 1 lands are previously or have not been disturbed. So they are the pristine lands, whereas Category 4 have already had some form of development that has taken place. So we have this notion in economics about sunk cost. In other words, we've already done some development in Category 4. That becomes then the status quo against which we're going to measure any future marginal impacts upon the area. And so I would, just without knowing a lot of detail about the two areas, it would seem to me that exploration development of a currently pristine environment will have a larger range of possible consequences than we would have from a Category 4. Now, that doesn't give carte blanche to Category 4 to go ahead, because some of those impacts could definitely be so large as to sway any of the potential benefits from it. There might be new techniques, for example, that would need to be used that would involve some additional form of degradation to the environment. So in that sense, there is a distinction, but they still both need to be evaluated from a kind of broader perspective. And I guess the other issue that might come up here is we were talking earlier about cumulative effects. And this is where we really need to kind of look at Category 4 in some senses. I mean, I talked about sunk cost, but there may be marginal cumulative effects going forward that could have a larger, far-reaching consequences than what we previously thought.
Right. So really, a lot of the focus on incremental effects. So the watershed impacts might be just as large, Cat 4 versus 2, but direct recreational use would differ if Category 4 is an area that's not used. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I want to turn to kind of the finishing, as we go to the finish here on policy development. So for all three of you, I mean, this May to now coal, I want to call it a fiasco, because it's sort of been a fiasco, has really shown a spotlight on policy development by government, and get your thoughts as people who have been close to policy formation. So, arguably, one could make the argument that reforms to the 1976 coal policy are needed. Nigel's talked about some deficiencies in other areas that perhaps the coal policy was kind of papering over. So reforms are possibly needed. The issue here probably, it appears to be the way in which the government made these changes, i.e. quietly, with no consultation critically. It bred mistrust. I think people were mistrusting of what was happening, what were the motives. So how does the government meaningfully course correct at this point? Is there a way to regain trust on this file? Have they done enough with the reinstatement? What steps are critical as we go forward to ensure that the consultation that's about to take place is meaningful? And I guess lessons for future policy development. A broad-ranging question for your final remarks of the session. Who would like to start?
Well,
go ahead.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say, not surprisingly, that I think it would help if government started with a clear statement of what it possibly considers the range of alternatives to be, and some objective analysis of the consequences, as we've been talking about, the full range of environmental, local community, and economic consequences, what assumptions it makes, what risks and uncertainties it's facing, to provide that kind of framework to say, this is what we think will happen with the alternatives that we think are relevant here. And if it wants to go the next step, and this is why we favor going in a certain direction, whether it's opening up some lands or closing it off in different ways, or the various regulatory framework it might consider. And that could set the stage for a very healthy consultation process where people can say whether they agree with that analysis or not, whether the alternatives are broad enough or not, whether their interests and concerns have been addressed or not, and help focus a very clear discussion in a meaningful way of values and interests, as opposed to just somebody going back to that single criteria. I want to do this because there'll be some jobs in a particular region, or I want not to do this because I'm concerned about X. So I think that would be very helpful for that process.
Nigel?
Yeah, so I'll weigh in a bit, because I mean, what we know is that the minister has promised consultation, but it's also been indicated that that consultation will be led by the Department of Energy. And it seems to me that that's challenging. And it's challenging for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Department of Energy, I don't think, has a good record on consultation. And there's a reason for that. A lot of the energy-related consultation is done by other people. It's done by the Utilities Commission, it's done by the Electric System Operator, and it's done to some degree by the AER. And all of those entities are much better set up to consult than the Department of Energy is. So when the Department of Energy historically does consultation, it does it with a very narrow stakeholder group. And so there's a general problem with the Department of Energy leading this. And there's an even more important difficulty in this case, because the key issue is land use planning. And the Department of Energy has no expertise in land use planning. We have an entire different bureaucracy, the Land Use Secretariat under the regional planning process, which is far better suited. So yes, maybe energy's got something to contribute, which might be, you know, the future of metallurgical coal likely will demand and opportunities for sourcing that demand. But I don't think a consultation led by energy in relation to land use planning is going to be particularly fruitful. So I think we need to think about ways of tying this into the existing legislative framework under the land stewardship legislation. And interestingly, there is, while it's very much a regional planning process, there is also provision in the Act for issue-specific planning. Now, it's not a very well developed idea in the Act, but maybe this is something we should be looking at. But I think in any event, we're into a multi-year process, not just, oh, here's 90 days consultation, let's move on. ALSA has set the bar for what land use planning should look like, and it's an intensive consultation, multi-year process. And I think if anything less is offered by the Department of Energy, it's not going to be convincing.
Interesting. So these changes, these developments have really highlighted the need to go beyond this single policy issue and really deal with the broader regional development planning. Diane, you get the final word on today.
Oh, the final word.
Final
all right.
thoughts?
I was just going to say, I mean, if we think about the evolution of what people expect from their governments, I think there's been a change in the expectation that governments will be transparent in terms of developing policies and will seek consultation with the broadest possible set of stakeholders. So in terms of people being happy with the results, or at least content with the results, I think it's important that the government does in fact seek, you know, do a comprehensive evaluation. And for many stakeholders, they may not understand what the trade-offs are, because we've been talking about trade-offs. Some things really need to be explained so that people can make informed decisions and can be content with the decisions. So certainly I would hope that the Alberta government does do this.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. That was really enlightening for me, and I hope it was for all of the attendees. Thank you all for joining us. And as Ashley has posted on the chat, you can view more webinars and upcoming events at policyschool.ca/webinars. And if you're here in Alberta, we've come out of our deep freeze. It looks like a +1 or 2 degrees and sunny out there. So go enjoy your Friday. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.